Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Baker Institute. I know many of you are visiting us for the first time tonight, so I'm going to do a little propaganda. Allow me to describe briefly what we do here. The Baker Institute is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to lending a meaningful voice to decision makers on domestic and foreign policy issues. We have built our policy research programs on the principle of comparative advantage. Obviously, Houston, for example, the energy capital of the world, we have a very vibrant geopolitics of energy program. We do space policy because NASA to the south of us, and of course, right across the street, many of you I know are from the Texas Medical Center. We do health economics and are gravitating toward a much more comprehensive health policy program. We are celebrating the Baker Institute's 20th anniversary this year, and access to high-level policymakers and our proven impact on policy has led to a consistent ranking among top think tanks in the U.S. and worldwide as a global think tank. And our fellows and scholars represent distinguished academics and practitioners in the fields of cybersecurity, energy, Middle East, public finance, health policy, and other public policy issues. We are expanding our programs, and our speaker's presence here tonight is part of that, and adding new research fellows in energy, international economics, Middle East, and again, most prominently tonight on health policy. We're also establishing new endowments and creating new student exchange programs, both domestically and abroad. As a financially independent organization, the Institute functions mainly through the support of the very generous Houston community. And one of our principal means of support is the Baker Institute Roundtable that provides its members with special programs and access to the Institute's activities. And many opportunities are offered to meet with our distinguished guests, our policy fellows, and engage in the public policy issue deliberation. So I do want to make a unvarnished pitch that if you enjoy the discussion tonight and its example, I also hope some of you will consider joining our roundtable and continuing to participate in our public policy deliberations. Well, we're delighted that tonight's speaker, Dr. Peter Hotez, recently joined our ranks of fellows and scholars studying health policy. Our health policy team includes Dr. Vivian Ho, who is here. She is our fellow in health economics and dealing with one of the most critical domestic health issues in our country. Some people call it Obamacare, but it's the cost effectiveness of health care, and Vivian is a noted national expert in this field. Dr. John Mendelson is the former very preeminent president of the MD Anderson Cancer Center. He has joined us as a senior fellow in health and technology recently last year. Elena Marks is our scholar in healthcare policy, and Dr. Kirsten Matthews in stem cell policy. Another recent addition is Dr. Deepak Srivastava, director of the Gladstone Institute for Cardiovascular Disease. He has just signed on to serve as a non-resident Baker Institute scholar for biomedical research policy. Within the Baker Institute Health Policy program, Dr. Hotez brings the ability to engage not only with the issues of health, science, economics, and regulation, but also in broader public policy global health challenges. Since Dr. Hotez joined us last year, he has written extensively. As you who know him, he is very prolific, and we love that. He's written extensively on public policy toward neglected tropical diseases around the world. His opinion pieces in the New York Times, Houston Chronicle, and other media have advocated strongly for increased awareness that tropical diseases are not confined to developing countries, but can be found in the United States, including right here in South Texas. Dr. Hotez also works to implement his policy recommendations through vaccine diplomacy. As the president and director of the Sabin Vaccine Institute, he has partnered with the Ministries of Health in Mexico and Brazil to develop and transfer technologies to combat tropical diseases like hookworm, Chagas disease, and schistosomiasis. Did I get that right, Peter?
Perfect.
Very good. In addition to all of this, he is also the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine, endowed chair of the Tropical Pediatrics at Texas Children's Hospital, co-editor-in-chief of the Public Library of Science Journal on Neglected Tropical Diseases. I got to tell you, Peter, you have more positions than our honorary chair, Secretary of State James A. Baker. I would never say that in his presence. So please welcome our new Baker Institute Fellow in Disease and Poverty, Peter Hotez.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that extremely generous introduction. And before I start, I'd like to give a shout out to my lab and department and school and people from Baylor College of Medicine who have heard me speak way too many times already, but I do very much appreciate the support and the unwavering support that you've given me in so many ways. Tonight, I'm hoping to break a little bit of new ground, talk about some things that I haven't spoken before. But I want to leave you, if you don't remember anything else tonight, I'd like you to remember this quote from Elie Wiesel. And I didn't want to memorize it and say it because it's got too many double negatives, and I knew I'd screw it up if I tried to say it. So I have it here in front of me, and it says that he says that man's weakness lies not in his inability to obtain victories, but in his inability to make use of them. And the context of this is that we now have a lot of victories. We have a lot of drugs, we have a lot of diagnostics, and now through our activities at Baylor College of Medicine, we're making new vaccines as well. And I'm optimistic that we're going to have new vaccines over the next 5 to 10 years. Those are the victories, but after working so hard for so many years to develop these victories, to achieve these victories, I now have the uneasy feeling that we've just done the easy part. Because the problem is that our technology has outpaced our social and political institutions to make use of them. And this is why I worked so hard I'd like to make them think that Baker Institute was recruiting me, but it was really me trying to become part of the Baker Institute. Because what we need, we don't have a public policy shaped to make use of the victories, to make use of the drugs and vaccines and diagnostics. And I think this is going to be one of the most important areas that we have to enter into over the next couple of decades, is shaping both a foreign policy as well as a policy within a lot of the disease endemic countries to massively expand global access and to actually work out how these countries are going to cooperate together in a meaningful way. And I'm going to provide new information that suggests it's going to be more important than ever for countries to cooperate in interesting and unusual ways, and I'll explain more of that as I go along. These are the people that we're primarily going to be addressing today. Paul Collier, the Oxford economist, I don't know if he coined the term, but at least he popularized it, the bottom billion. It refers to the fact that we now have the new number. It's been going down regularly, but we still have about 1.3 billion people today who live on no money, live below the World Bank poverty figure of $1.25 a day, and 40% live on less than $2 a day. Now you might say, well, why am I talking about economics from the start? And that's because even though we call them tropical diseases or neglected tropical diseases, it's a misnomer. It's not tropical climates. It's actually, and many people are surprised when I say this, it's not even global warming, although that has some impact. It's first and foremost poverty. Poverty is the overriding determinant of tropical diseases and neglected tropical diseases. The two go hand in hand. These diseases both occur in the setting of poverty, and as I'll explain a little bit later, they actually cause poverty, and I think they're the stealth reason why the bottom billion are trapped in poverty. And I'm showing you these pictures here because I find them very inspirational. They're photographs taken by my friend Elizabeth Jordan, who's a photographer in New York, who takes these amazing pictures of people living in severe poverty, and she takes them in such a way that, first of all, they're incredibly beautiful pictures because of the use and reuse of color, but also the way it preserves. She has this unique way of using her photographs to preserve their dignity, and I find these pictures extremely inspirational. I'm actually she donated one of them for the cover of the next edition of our book on neglected tropical diseases, and I'm very excited about that. Now, the reason, and I hope I can convince you of this today, one of the major reasons why the bottom billion remains in the bottom billion is because all of them are infected with one or more of these diseases, which is a term we coined around 2004, 2005, abbreviated the NTD, otherwise known as the neglected tropical diseases. And the point being, all of the bottom billion are infected with one or more neglected tropical disease. And I'm going to rank them for you. These are the most common conditions, adverse health conditions of the world's poor. So the people my Baylor friends who've heard this too many times can't answer this, but the others can. So this is the most common health condition of the world's poorest people. What is it? Yeah. Roundworm, exactly right. So this little boy on the right here has roundworm. In fact, you can run your hand over the surface of his belly and palpate the outline of worms in his intestinal tract. So a lot of these diseases are wormy diseases. So ascariasis, the most common infection of the world's poor. This is a picture taken by one of my students from Haiti. 700 million people have hookworm. You're probably guessing, well, if I add up 800 million and 700 million, that already adds up to more than 1.3 billion. Why is that? People are polyparasitized. They have a menagerie of organisms, whether it's in their intestinal tract or elsewhere. They have multiple neglected tropical diseases at the same time. This is another parasitic worm infection. The disease that you so eloquently pronounced, Ambassador, schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia. 400 million people have these worms in their vasculature. 100 million people have filarial worms in their genitals and lymphatics. Foodborne trematode infections, this is dengue, river blindness, trachoma, leishmaniasis, Chagas disease, and then we get some ones that are less common, Bruley ulcer and sleeping sickness. So the point being that everybody in the bottom billion club has one or more of these diseases, and their impact is not what you'd think. So it's not so much death. So most of those diseases that I just showed you are not killer diseases. Instead, they're disablers. And they're disablers because they reduce children's ability to grow and develop. They affect people, make two people to go to sick to work every day, or they affect pregnancy outcome. So one of the problems that we have with these diseases is we don't have a good metric to describe why they're so important, because it's not easy to quantify disability. It's not easy to quantify getting too sick to go to work every day or getting too sick to grow and develop normally. So we've been working with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle at the University of Washington, where they derived this figure known as the DALY, the Disability Adjusted Life Year, and it describes the fact that these diseases are causing disability, and it stands for the number of healthy life years lost, either from premature death or disability. And it allows us to say, well, these diseases are as bad as diseases that everyone knows, like ischemic heart disease or cancer, but they exclusively affect the bottom billion. And not only that, they have the ability to cause poverty. We can show that India loses $1 billion a year from one neglected tropical disease called lymphatic filariasis. It makes people too sick to go to work every day, so it reduces productive capacity. And it makes kids stupid. The more hookworm you have, the lower your intelligence. And not only that, the economists have shown that hookworm infection reduces your future wage earning by 40%. Why is that? Why does hookworm reduce your future wage earning by 40%? Anybody guess? Wage earning, yeah. Well, probably because it shaves IQ points off, and we think that's why. It's actually reducing your intelligence. It causes adverse pregnancy outcomes. So this concept is very important, that the NTDs actually will cause poverty. And in fact, we can even show that these cause so much poverty to the point where they're destabilizing, where farmers often and their families have to abandon certain agricultural lands because these neglected tropical diseases are so widespread. So this is a very important element of destabilization linked with the neglected tropical diseases. Let me show you an example, a couple of examples, just to kind of bring it home. So I'm talking to you about these intestinal worm infections, Ascaris, trichuris, and hookworm. And here I'm showing you age class 0 to 3, 4 to 7, 8 to 12, and this is the prevalence of people infected with either these Ascaris worms, hookworms, or trichuris, the leading neglected tropical diseases. And what's impressive is the fact that almost basically all of the kids, 100%, in this village of Paquila, Guatemala, are infected with worms. And the point I like to show this is because if you were to go to the next village over in rural Guatemala, you'd find the same thing. In fact, you go to any rural village in a low-income country, and you'll find that 100% of the kids are parasitized with hookworm, roundworm, or trichuris. And they particularly have a predilection for children. So what I'm showing you here is age on the x-axis, number of worms on the y-axis, and you see that in the endemic countries of the world, it's children that have the largest number of worms, which we don't know why. We have absolutely no understanding. So these are incredible. These diseases have been neglected so long, even though these are the most common infections of the world's poorest people. We don't even know fundamental things of why children have more worms than adults. So you get this situation like this little girl in Paraguay here with a big belly, and those are the worms from that one child that you see over there. We don't know why this child has so many worms. And the consequences are, we can show that the more worms you have, the greater your loss in IQ, the greater your loss in intelligence. Why is that? Why do worms suppress intelligence?
I'll say that because I had many of them, and hopefully I'm not.
Because they diminish nutrition to the brain?
That's a brilliant. So the ambassador said because they diminish nutrition to the brain. That's actually my hypothesis as well, but we have no idea. These are neglected tropical diseases. So this is the world's leading neuropsychiatric disturbance, and we don't even have any idea. There's not a single published paper on the mechanism. And they not only suppress intelligence, they suppress physical growth as well. So here's age on the x-axis, weight on the y-axis. And if you remember from your children's or your grandchildren's pediatrician visits, or in some cases I see people young enough to remember their own pediatrician's visits, here's age, and you would follow yourself along a different growth curve. And here's a child with flatline growth until we intervene to get rid of the worms, and you start seeing catch-up growth. So the worms are not only suppressing intelligence, but they're also suppressing growth. Why is that?
It's very unnerving, worms, and so it distracts you from
It does distract you, and it also causes you to lose your appetite, so it causes anorexia, so maybe that's part of it, maybe robbing nutrients, but we don't know. But the point being that the effects go beyond health, because, as I was mentioning, hookworm leads to a 40% reduction in future wage earning, and this is a concept that we'll come back to. They occur in the setting of poverty, but these are the stealth cause of poverty. These are so ubiquitous. These are the reason why children don't grow to their full potential, why people are too sick to go to work. The poverty-promoting effects of these diseases is absolutely overwhelming. Let me give you another example, schistosomiasis. This was a disease in medical school we used to call urinary tract schistosomiasis. It occurs in an estimated 400 million people in the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So you're talking basically a third of the bottom billion has this disease. So you remember, any time you see the effects of these diseases, multiply it times a Carl Sagan-like number, several 100 million, 1 billion, just to give you a sense of this. So this is a disease we used to call urinary tract schistosomiasis until we realized that 75% of the girls and women with this disease actually have those same lesions on their cervix, their uterus, their lower genital tract. These diseases are so ignored, particularly among girls and women, no one ever bothered to do a colposcopic exam on the girls and women with this condition. So all the medical textbooks talk about urinary tract schistosomiasis because it's in the men, has urinary tract schistosomiasis. It's in the women too, but they also have these horrific lesions on their cervix and uterus, and it's a source of bleeding and pain. There's a huge stigma attached to it. It's a source of, now it's been linked to unipolar depression in girls and women. This is not a rare disease. This is 100 million girls and women in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the most common gynecologic condition in sub-Saharan Africa. I like to call it one of the most important diseases of girls and women you've never heard of. And now it's been linked to a 3 to 4-fold increase in horizontal transmission of HIV/AIDS. So that if you look, here's where schistosomiasis is in southeastern Africa. Here's where HIV/AIDS is, and you see enormous levels of overlap. I think this is Africa's most important cofactor in the Africa has AIDS epidemic, but it's a neglected tropical diseases, and nobody knows about it. So there's a lot of collateral effects on other diseases, on AIDS, malaria, and other respiratory infections as well. So what do we do about it? Well, I want to talk about our first victory. First, I'm going to talk about the victories, then I'll talk about the opportunities for taking that further. So our first victory in these neglected tropical disease. Who's this? So it was not Stephen Hawking who made our first victory, but it was his father. So Stephen Hawking, the great cosmologist, his father, Frank Hawking, was experimenting with a drug which goes by the unwieldy name of diethylcarbamazine citrate, DEC. And he showed that if you gave large populations in an endemic area a single dose of the medicine once a year, you could actually interrupt transmission of the disease. In this case, it was elephantiasis, lymphatic filariasis. In other words, by mass treatment, almost using a medicine, it's not a vaccine, it was a medicine, but using it like a vaccine to treat everybody at the same time, you could actually eliminate the disease as a public health problem. And the great thing about it was practically free. A box of 1,000 tablets cost $4. So 0.4 cents a tablet once a year. In fact, he even showed, and he published this in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization in 1967, that you can mix it up in the salt supply in the village, so that while people are salting their food while cooking, ingesting the salt, instead of iodizing it, they were DECing it, they could actually achieve the same effect, and it cost practically nothing. And this was an exciting observation. In this case, the Chinese really did take advantage of the victory, because the paper was published in 1967. The Chinese scaled it up as only the Chinese could, where they medicated the entire salt supply of eastern China with diethylcarbamazine citrate. Only the Chinese could do some of these things. And in fact, there's a very intimate history between these diseases and the history of modern China. China provided the proof of concept that you could do mass dosing of a medicine that was dirt cheap, almost free, and eliminate the disease as a public health problem. And this was quite exciting because the World Health Organization looked at China as a role model, and this is the term I use, franchising it. And the other term besides mass drug administration we use is sometimes called preventive chemotherapy. And so the World Health Organization looked at that victory that the Chinese had and said, well, let's take DEC and try it out in the South Pacific Islands of Vanuatu, Cook Islands, Samoa. It worked. They were able to reproduce it. You cannot use DEC in Africa, and the reason you cannot use DEC in Africa is it causes a toxic reaction on somebody who is co-infected with river blindness, which is also widespread. But what happened was there was a second drug that was developed by Merck & Company, and it was not developed, weren't developing it for these diseases because there's no money to make on these diseases. They were actually developing it for veterinary diseases, for parasites of cattle and sheep, but they showed it also worked for people. And Merck and Company, the first drug they developed for this was ivermectin. They realized there's no profit to be made. They donated it free of charge. So they had now two medicines in hand. You had one costing 0.4 cents a tablet, one absolutely free. So you get the message. You're slowly factoring out the cost of the medicine, and yet you could give them through mass drug administration, through very simple means, once a year to large populations. Pfizer looked at what Merck did and said, well, I better give something away as well. And they started giving away Zithromax. Anyone take a Z-Pack in the last few weeks? Anyone not take a Z-Pack in the last few weeks? Right, so Pfizer, you take it for your upper respiratory infection, your strep throat, your otitis media. Pfizer makes $1 gazillion on it. It also works for trachoma, a neglected tropical disease. And through mass drug administration, it's being given away. So what was happening is you were seeing these great pockets of success actually eliminating neglected tropical diseases through this concept of mass dosing of medicines that industry is basically donating. This is a story, or part of the story anyway, where industry is actually the good guys, where they are have made lots of money on some drugs. They also work for neglected tropical diseases, and they donate it because there's no business model to support how you're going to make money on it, which becomes a problem later on that we'll get to. So one of the things that we did was we looked at the world not from the standpoint of an economist or a sociologist, but from the standpoint of a neglected tropical disease physician. And I worked with two physicians in the UK, two parasitologists in the UK, David Molyneux and Alan Fennick in University of Liverpool and Imperial College London. And this looks like a map that we drew out very much on a napkin in a bar in Berlin, but I made it a little bit nicer. And it's basically showing that these colors in red are countries that have multiple neglected tropical diseases at the same time. Remember, I told you they add up to more than 1.3 billion. And it's showing you that in many parts of the world, you have Ascaris, trichuris, hookworm, schistosomiasis, lymphatic filariasis, onchocerciasis, trachoma, and foodborne trematode infections. And they can all be targeted by several different medicines. And so what we did was we said, well, what if we combine them in a package? Could we administer that package? And we looked at that opportunity, and we had to do a little bit of branding. So we called it the Rapid Impact Package. And the idea is that you can give these medicines, which includes albendazole or mebendazole, our friend DEC or ivermectin, praziquantel or Zithromax. And because Pfizer, the German Merck, the American Merck, the Japanese company Eisai, Johnson & Johnson, and GlaxoSmithKline were donating it free of charge, we can not only take on the 7 most common neglected tropical disease and move towards control and elimination, but because the medicines are free, we costed out that we could deliver this for 50 cents a person per year. So imagine taking on a group of diseases that are as important as coronary heart disease or cancer or HIV/AIDS, and over time, over a period of years, eliminating them as public health problems, in the case of several of them, for 50 cents a person per year. So we had an amazing story to tell. And here's where the policy part came in. So we wrote these 2 papers about it, and they were published in an open access journal, the Public Library of Science, which we since got connected to. And we thought we had a great idea. What do you do next? Well, the good thing was I had absolutely no idea what public policy was. And all I knew how to do was be a scientist and an advocate who was in Washington at the time, and to be as shrill as I possibly could. And that's what I did. And the other lucky break I had was this was happening at a time in Washington when Republicans still talked to Democrats. Because if I tried to do this now, absolutely nothing would have happened. But we worked with for weird reasons, we had access to President Clinton, but the administration of George Bush turned absolutely essential. He had an amazing group of people in his cabinet, in his White House, people like Mark Dybul and Tommy Thompson, former Health and Human Services Secretary, but also we had two senators who could not be further apart ideologically. You had Sam Brownback, senator from Kansas, who's now the governor, and Senator Leahy from Vermont, who we were able to work with to persuade them on the benefits of this package. And what they were so excited about was the fact that they were so common, they were so important. In Senator Brownback's case, he was really thrilled that I told him these diseases have been reported on in the Bible. These are not emerging infections. These have been around since ancient times, and he had me address his group of political conservatives, and I talked about the biblical diseases. I made sure I used the B word, whatever it took. And there was a policy, an advocacy organization known as the Global Health Council, headed by Niels Dallaire, who's now at HHS. And we're able, and then later in the Obama administration, we worked with Zeke Emanuel to get funds appropriated. Now, it wasn't a lot of money. It started out with $15 million. But 50 cents a person per year, how many people can you treat for $15 million? 30 million. And we worked with USAID. Congress appropriated it. USAID really liked it because it was so inexpensive compared to anything else they were doing, and they scaled it up to the point where they started embarking on mass treatment programs in more than a dozen countries, which includes sub-Saharan Africa, but not exclusively. So this is where we're at right now. The problem is, even after all of that, and then my colleagues in the UK who I was working with started working with DFID, the British Department for International Development, and I spent a lot of time in the UK, and at that time it was Tony Blair, then Gordon Brown, who got also very excited about it. Here's where we're at today. Today we're only reaching we're reaching about a third of the bottom billion who need that preventive chemotherapy. So one of the things that I'm very concerned about is we have total reliance on public support from two countries, the United States and the United Kingdom. They're footing the bill for all of it. And we're really relying completely on the US and the UK to take this on. So one of the things that we decided to do was to create an organization known as the Global Network for Neglected Tropical Disease to start raising funds privately. Because we're not talking about billions, we're talking about millions, which seem to me is achievable. And the Global Network has created this very nice promotional video. What do I have to do to turn this on? Does anybody? Oh, there it is. Oh, I see. You got a little. This is a little promotional video we're
at the
doing.
Beginning of something big. We're on a mission to see the end of 7 diseases. You may never have heard of elephantiasis, river blindness, snail fever, trachoma, hookworm, whipworm, or roundworm. But over 500 million children in the developing world have these diseases living and breeding inside their bodies. The effects are devastating. They stop children from going to school, they stop parents from going to work, and they take away any chance families have of lifting themselves out of poverty. Without treatment, they can lead to lifelong disabilities and suffering. But for once, this is something we know we can end, because we've got the solution. A simple packet of pills. What's more, many drug companies are providing them for free. All we need now are your donations, so we can deliver these pills to the people who need them most and set up treatment programs that the communities can run themselves. We've done the math. And with just 50 cents, you can treat and protect one child for 1 year against all 7 diseases. And you are just the start. We need you to get your friends, your family, and your co-workers to get involved. Because with enough of these tiny donations, we can do something huge. We can see the end of all 7 diseases by 2020. So join us, and together we can see the end.
So it's a compelling story, and if you get a guy with a British accent to tell it, it becomes really believable. And that British accent, we found, adds actually 10 IQ points. And if you have the bow tie, it's 10 as well. And if you have the British accent and the bow tie, it's synergistic for 25. There are problems here. One of the problems is we don't have all the information we need to know where to give these medicines and exactly how. So here's a map of the ambassador's favorite disease, schistosomiasis, where the red is over here. Now you see this big gaping hole in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic. It's not because the diseases aren't there. It's why? How do you get people to do the work there, to do the mapping? So that becomes a problem. The other thing that we're finding is within the U.S. government as well as the British government, programs are very siloed. So the AIDS people and PEPFAR, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, don't talk to the neglected tropical disease people. So you have enormous inefficiencies because of that as well. So that's something that we're working on. Now this is a new analysis that we've just completed. And I got an awakening and surprise. I'm working now with the Institute for Health Metrics again to look at the most important neglected tropical diseases. And one of the things that we found is that whereas I assumed that most of the neglected tropical diseases would be found in sub-Saharan Africa, in our analysis, what we found is no, that's not the case. They're actually in the countries of the largest amount of wealth in the world, the big GDP countries, meaning the G20 countries. So here's a map of the G20 countries, and here are the numbers. So with the exception of schistosomiasis on the bottom, which is still pretty much almost purely a sub-Saharan Africa disease, that's the outlier, that's the exception. If you look at the G20 countries, 77% of the world's leprosy occurs in G20 countries, 71% of foodborne trematode infections, 67% of leishmaniasis, 61% of Chagas disease, 60% of lymphatic filariasis, and almost half the world's hookworm. What do you do with that piece of information? Well, let's go in a little more in the weeds. By the G20 countries, these diseases are not homogeneously distributed. They're occurring among pockets of extreme poverty in the G20 countries. So they're occurring in southern Mexico or northern India or in the light part of Brazil here, northeastern Brazil, or in the eastern part of Indonesia. Living in the G20 countries are most of the world's bottom billion. So 60% of the world's bottom billion actually live in G20 countries. And I don't mean to single out India, Mexico, Indonesia, and Brazil. We also have China. So there's been an enormous expansion of wealth in eastern China, but that's left behind a significant number of bottom billion in Sichuan province, Yunnan province, Guizhou province, in the southwestern provinces of China. We have high rates of neglected tropical diseases. And guess what? We have poor people in the United States. So do we have neglected tropical diseases here as well? Well, I think so, and I'm almost certain of it. So the new numbers are that we have 46 million Americans living in poverty, and I wouldn't say for a minute that that level of poverty is equivalent to the poverty in Indonesia or Guatemala. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the 20 million people that currently live in the United States in extreme poverty. That is a standard deviation below. And now the new numbers coming out of the University of Michigan Poverty Center says for the first time that anyone's ever measured it, we have 1.5 million families that live on less than $2 a day in this country, about 5 million people. So we have a bottom 5 million in this country. And with it, we have found high rates of neglected tropical diseases. So this includes Chagas disease, which is predominant in South Texas. Christy Murray, who's a faculty member in our group, has now has preliminary evidence of 10% Chagas disease among the homeless in Houston. And that's That's excluding people with Hispanic heritage. We're talking predominantly among African Americans living in extreme poverty in Houston. She's even identified certain bridges where people sleep under that's been linked with Chagas disease. We've had dengue in Houston probably for the last decade, and nobody knows about it. And where is it occurring? It's occurring mostly in East Houston, the 5th Ward, the 3rd Ward. Why is that? Why is dengue occurring in the 3rd Ward and the 5th Ward? Well, we don't know. And we have no budget to look at that right now. But the hypothesis that Christy Murray has is that people in the 5th Ward and the 3rd Ward, when you actually drive through there, first of all, it was eye-opening for me because, I thought I knew what poverty looked like living in Washington, D.C. The level of poverty living in this part of the country is a whole different animal. I mean, it's really quite distressing. You see absence of garbage pickup, people who have no indoor screens, no air conditioning, or they have those box-like air conditioners that allow the mosquitoes to go in. I think this is why we're seeing it. High rates among the homeless. And so much so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to start the School of Tropical Medicine here in Texas, while it was modeled on the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, we thought we could go one step further because we have neglected tropical diseases right here in the state. And so our numbers that I've come up with are 5 million Americans living with neglected tropical diseases. So what do you do with this information? Well, I actually thought, boy, after we're struggling so hard to get neglected tropical diseases in places like sub-Saharan Africa or India on the radar screen, this would be a piece of cake, right? That it would be, all I'd have to do is write a few op-ed pieces and be as shrill as I possibly could, just like I was with neglected tropical diseases in developing countries, and people would flock to it. I'm wrong. So it's been near impossible to get attention on the policymakers on this. So I managed to get a meeting, thanks to Herb Buttram and our government affairs group with the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, which was a group that during the Bush administration was very helpful with neglected tropical diseases. It's going to be a hard sell. And this, again, is why we need a policy institute to help us build something more coherent around this concept. So what the idea that I want to introduce is that when we talk about global health problems, I think it's too simplistic to talk about developed versus developing countries. It's not the United States versus sub-Saharan Africa. What we're finding is this unexpected neglected tropical disease burden in the G20 countries, and the G20 countries share a level of economic wealth that make it possible to treat all of the bottom billion people who need neglected tropical diseases. The idea that these countries have the largest 20 GDPs, gross domestic products, in the countries. Why aren't we working together with these G20 countries to really expand mass treatments to finish the job as outlined in the video? So I've been kicking around a name for this. It's not your father's global health or your mother's global health. It's something different. It's intense pockets of poverty among the wealthiest countries accounting for the lion's share of these diseases. So when I was a kid growing up, I was one of these kids that would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and watch the Gemini launches and the Apollo launches. And so I was inspired by this picture taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts of the Earth, and they called it the Big Blue Marble. So here's my working title here, Blue Marble Health, to remark on the fact that this is something quite different. And now, what I want to do is take that concept of blue marble health and present to you a concept that here's an opportunity for science diplomacy, because not only are these neglected tropical these G20 countries, the countries that have the highest disease burden from neglected tropical disease, they also have a pretty high level of sophistication when it comes to biotechnology. So India, China, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Indonesia make many of their own drugs and vaccines. In fact, they've consolidated in a network called the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, but they don't really work together. What an incredible opportunity for purposes of science diplomacy to develop all of the tools that we need to finish the job for the 17 neglected tropical diseases. The Mass Drug Administration is going to take us part of the way. It's actually going to eliminate lymphatic filariasis, trachoma, and possibly river blindness. But the other 14, we're going to need better and improved control tools, including control tools for the United States. We don't have the means to eliminate Chagas disease right now in the United States. What a great opportunity for these countries to work together. And in that sense, I was very much inspired by the story of Albert Sabin. And many people don't realize it, but that the oral polio vaccine, so Albert Sabin developed the oral polio vaccine that many of us took as children. Many of us don't realize that he did not do that in isolation. Through a bizarre set of circumstances, he actually developed that oral polio vaccine jointly with the Soviets, and he did it in 1957, 1958, 1959. What was happening in 1957, 1958, and 59 in terms of relations between the Soviet Union and the U.S.? Yeah, it was the Cold War, and it was a bad time in the Cold War, right? When was the Sputnik launch? 1957. When did the Soviet Union deploy its first large-scale hydrogen bomb? 1957. And yet, despite that, the two countries were able to put aside their ideologies to allow Dr. Chumakov, and this is his telegram that he sent, they got a copy of, to Dr. Sabin after he visited. Sabin sent him some of the polio vaccines. Sabin ultimately went with Chumakov back to the Soviet Union. That's where they actually made the vaccine. So the virus strains were developed in Sabin's lab, but Sabin went back with Chumakov and a guy named Zhdanov and a guy named Smorodentsov, and together they made the oral polio vaccine, tested it on tens of millions of Soviet school children, showed it was safe and effective, and that's what led to the development of the vaccine and licensure that's now leading to the eradication of polio. So I'm very intrigued by the idea of countries working together who maybe are at ideological differences. What I'm showing you here are the countries of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Our analysis also shows that about 30 to 40% of the world's neglected tropical disease occur in Islamic countries. So what about collaborating with the Iranians on a leishmaniasis vaccine, or the Pakistanis on a leishmaniasis vaccine, or the Indonesians on a schistosomiasis vaccine? How do we do that? We do not have any kind of foreign policy framework to even really begin thinking about this. So science diplomacy in so many ways has become sort of the poor stepchild of public policy. We're still at a very nascent, very rudimentary stage, and yet the opportunities, I think, are enormous, partly because we have a lot of advocates. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation 2 years ago launched the Decade of Vaccines and created this alliance known as the Gavi Alliance, and their idea is we need to accelerate the use of existing vaccines, but also make new vaccines. And one of their ideas is to expand the not only manufacturing capacity in industrialized countries, the GSKs and the Pfizers of the world, but also look at vaccine manufacturers based in emerging markets. So I think there's an incredible opportunity here now to expand that. The problem is they need management and they need focus. And for that, the Gates Foundation has helped to stimulate the formation of a new type of organization. And they are known as Product Development Partnerships, or PDPs. And product development partnerships are nonprofit organizations that use industry practices to work with manufacturers in developed countries and developing countries, and sometimes their own laboratories, to make stuff. And by stuff, I mean diagnostics, therapeutic products, mean small molecule drugs, or vaccines, and these are the different categories. So there's 16 of them that the Gates Foundation has launched like little boats that I sometimes like to call guaranteed money-losing companies. They're basically biotech companies that make products for people who can never hope to afford to pay for them. They include, let me give you a couple of examples. One is DNDi, the Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, which is based in Geneva. They make small molecule drugs for sleeping sickness, malaria, and Chagas disease and leishmaniasis. Another one is FIND, the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics. They're also based in Geneva. Most of these are virtual organizations. In other words, if you go into the offices of DNDi in Geneva, that's what you would see, offices, because everything is contracted out through through contract research organizations, contract manufacturing organizations. Ours has some virtual component, but our Sabin Vaccine Institute actually has its own labs, and our labs are based at the Feigen Center on the campus of Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine. And it's named after Albert Sabin, the discoverer of the polio vaccine, and we are taking on a portfolio of vaccine products that are urgently needed and yet nobody's developing. So they include a human hookworm vaccine, which is now which we now have in phase 1 clinical trials, schistosomiasis vaccine that we've completed manufacture for, and we're hoping to have it in clinical trials later this year, and then a new Chagas disease and leishmaniasis vaccines. We're taking on the vaccines that the big pharmaceuticals can't. Not because they're bad guys, they'll donate the medicines that they've made for another purpose, but they're not going to invest the research and development to make new products that are guaranteed to be total flops commercially because they're for the poorest people. So it's a new type of organization that we've created. Now, what we do is we file our own INDs in the U.S., but we work with, we span the full gamut of product development all the way up to phase 1 clinical trials and IND filing. So we have a hookworm vaccine now that our target product profile is to reduce 80% of the moderate and heavy hookworm infections. And there's a lot of really elegant science behind that I won't go into at this late hour, because it's quite interesting. How do you target something like a hookworm, which is basically an animal that feeds on blood? There's a lot of interesting science that goes behind it. But the concept is that over time, if you just use mass drug administration alone, you're going to get rebound infection, and yet you'll never eliminate the disease. But now our mathematical modelers will tell us that we can actually eliminate the disease if we had a hookworm vaccine. Or we have a new schistosomiasis vaccine that's shown a lot of promise. Now, that's the end game? Well, the end game for these vaccines is we're working with the Brazilians. So the Brazilians are a country that has great pockets of poverty, has hookworm and schistosomiasis, yet they are great overachievers in terms of biotechnology, and they're investing in biotechnology. So they're building this enormous building the size of 2 football fields for translational research. They have 2 nonprofit organizations that are government organizations. One's known as Bia Manguinhos, the other one's Instituto Butantan. We are transferring our technology to have it made by the Brazilians. The idea is the Brazilians would take on ownership. So it's very much a U.S.-Brazilian joint collaboration. We're in an earlier stage making a Chagas disease vaccines, taking advantage of the availability of genome projects. It's a huge maternal child health problem. The new face of Chagas disease is we estimate 300,000 pregnant women in Latin America have Chagas disease, including now 40,000 pregnant women in North America. We're getting vertical transmission rates from mother to baby around 5 to 10% of the time. It's a horrific problem. We have absolutely nothing to offer pregnant women right now with Chagas disease. We're trying to make that vaccine, and for this one, the Gates Foundation is supporting our hookworm vaccine. We have other small private sources of support for the schistosomiasis vaccine. Our Chagas vaccine, we're actually trying to develop jointly with the Mexicans, since they have some nascent vaccine development capability, and this one is being supported by a man named Len Benkenstein from the Southwest Electric Energy Medical Research Institute, which is an organization here in Houston, but we're also getting co-support now from the Carlos Slim Health Institute. So this is one of Carlos Slim's first ventures into biomedical science. So it's very much this complicated diagram over here is a consortium of different Texas and Mexican institutions to work together to produce a Chagas vaccine. So the question I'm asking for purposes of vaccine diplomacy, well, we're doing it with the Brazilians, we're doing it with the Mexicans, can we take it another step? And I don't have the answer to that, but I will say that we have found a disproportionate burden of neglected tropical diseases in the Middle East and North Africa, more than I would have thought. Around 65 million people living in poverty in the Middle East, and very high rates of diseases such as leishmaniasis in places like Iran and elsewhere in North Africa. So a year ago, I started getting emails from this organization, the Institut Pasteur in Tehran, because they are having a horrific problem with leishmaniasis. They still practice leishmanization, which predates vaccination, where they would scrape the lesions from somebody with leishmaniasis and inject live parasites into a person in order to affect immunity. They used this during the Iran-Iraq war. It often works, most of the time, but often it doesn't. And when things go bad, they go really bad because you get disseminated leishmaniasis. We're making a recombinant leishmaniasis vaccine. That would be a heck of a lot safer than anything that's being currently practiced. How do we do it? How do we work with the Iranians? So I've said to the State Department, well, if Albert Sabin and in the U.S. and the USSR could put aside their ideologies during the height of the Cold War, what about the U.S. and Iran putting aside their ideologies for purposes of a leishmaniasis vaccine? Actually, the people in the State Department are a lot smarter than I ever would have believed. They are totally on board with it. They're smart. They are committed. They think it's a great idea. Well, one of the guys said to me, it was really funny, well, Iran's too radioactive right now, and I didn't know if he was speaking metaphorically or literally. But it's just not going to happen right now. We're not going to get that tacit support from the U.S. State Department. But okay, but maybe Pakistan, right? Pakistan has a great scientific infrastructure. They have some nascent vaccine capabilities, although interestingly not as advanced as the Iranians, but still there. So this is an opportunity, I think, for vaccine diplomacy. But the hurdles are still formidable. I mean, aside from getting diplomatic permission or a license from Treasury to do this, that's actually the least of the problems. How do you get funding to get this thing started? Because, you need funding for transportation. I've got scientists that I have to commit to the project. I'm going to divert them now by going to Pakistan and Iran. So this comes it's great, not only actual expense, but in human resource capacity. So I think we have enormous opportunity to eliminate the world's 17 neglected tropical diseases, the most common infections of the world's poor, devastating the poor in the G20 countries of the world, also sub-Saharan Africa, enormous scientific capability among many important middle-income countries like Brazil, like Iran, like Pakistan, that's not being harnessed in any kind of meaningful framework in science diplomacy. And this is why I welcome the opportunity to be linked not only with what I consider the greatest medical college in the world, but also one of the finest public policy organizations in the world, because I think you need both to really make things like this happen. Just for kicks, we've now been asked by the Institute of Medicine to look who funds biomedical research. And these are what I did on this, and this document's going to come out tomorrow, I believe, on the Institute of Medicine website, where we looked at a nation's GDP on one and ranked them by GDP and the percentage they contribute to GDP and the percentage of public expenditures they do on research and development for neglected diseases. And it turns out the U.S. is by far and away the biggest contributor of neglected disease research, but allows you to point your finger at the underachievers. So China contributes 10% of the global economy in terms of GDP, less than 0.5% of research for neglected diseases, public expenditures. Japan, another big-time underachievers. And in response to this, Japan is now putting together a public-private partnership to expand their investment in neglected disease research. Another big underachiever is, I'll just give you the highlights, is Brazil. Italy is not doing their part. Russia is not doing their part. South Korea is not doing their part. Indonesia is not doing their part. So we have now a new Office of Global Health Diplomacy in the State Department. Should that be an activity they're engaged in to put public pressure on terms of doing research and development on these diseases? And here is the report. I was really pleasantly surprised that the Institute of Medicine let me put that information in and to make that recommendation in public that we need to put public pressure on these countries. I thought they'd be too conservative. There's some other interesting aspects that we can go into in more detail, but I think this will come out on the Institute of Medicine website. I thought it might be tonight, but I think it'll probably be tomorrow. I'm going to end now and just show you two last slides because I don't like pointing fingers at other countries unless I can point fingers at the United States ourselves. And this is the fact that we have a very ominous decline in our U.S. support for biomedical research. So even though the budget's been flat, in $1998, we've had a 30% drop in the National Institutes of Health. And I think one of the big problems, again, is we don't have strengths in advocacy and science diplomacy. And with that, we have a horrific rate of science illiteracy in the United States. And I blame that partly in science illiteracy in the U.S. Congress, and I blame that partly on the inability or unwillingness of people like myself in the scientific profession to serve as advocates, to engage in public policy, to be willing to be public intellectuals, and to speak out on these issues. And my evidence is this amazing study that Research America, which is a policy organization based in Washington, recently completed. They did this survey to find that 72% of Americans cannot name a living scientist. Of those that could, 15% mentioned Stephen Hawking, 1% said Bill Nye the Science Guy, 1% said Jim Watson. 59% of Americans cannot name an institution where biomedical research is conducted. 9% of the U.S. population could name the NIH as a place where biomedical research is conducted. Well, hello, no surprise that the NIH is suffering to this extent. Interestingly, 10% of the American population named the Mayo Clinic, which is not really a biomedical research powerhouse. They're a great clinic and they take amazing care of patients, but they're not really known as a research powerhouse. 6% named Johns Hopkins, 6% named St. Jude's Research Hospital, probably because of Danny Thomas. What percentage of people named Rice University? Yes, that's correct, 0. What percent mentioned Baylor College of Medicine? Yes, you're right again, 0. What percent mentioned MD Anderson Cancer Center? That's right, 0. So we of the biomedical research institutes of this fantastic Texas Medical Center have been worse than underachievers. They've been outright negligent in not figuring out a way to build in programs of public policy and advocacy. And that's why I get so upset when I see a big billboard that says, best hospital in Texas or best X in Texas. Who cares, right? I mean, and so sometimes the rivalries between these institutions really do seem like a tempest in a teapot sometime. And again, this is an opportunity, I think, to advocate for greater awareness of advocacy and policy, and why is that so important to our institutions. So I'll stop there. These are a list of some of our very important donors. And again, Ambassador, thank you so much for inviting me to become part of the Baker Institute and to be able to talk to you this evening. Thanks.
We have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand or comments. Yes, in the back.
Thank you so much for the content. Some of the countries that you mentioned that are not pulling their fair share have trade imbalances with us. And wouldn't this be wonderful if we could balance the scale with them providing what they owe us and have it more directed towards money for research and production or something such as China?
I think that's a brilliant idea. Yeah, I think, how you operationalize it, I don't know, but I love the concept. And there's actual precedent for that. So with our trade imbalance with India, India was allowed to keep the money in rupees and use it to invest in biomedical research through U.S.-India Scientific Exchange Program. But it's at a very tiny scale, but I like the idea of doing something more ambitious based on trade imbalances. It's a neat idea. Yes?
Did you see any difference in the G20 countries between those that have and don't have national health systems where the poorest can get treated?
I haven't done the analysis. So the question is, have we looked at national health systems among those countries? No, I haven't done that level of analysis yet. This is just brand new, and so I think it's more hypothesis generating than testing. It creates a lot of interesting ideas to look at in more detail.
The leishmaniasis vaccine, I was just to kind of finish out that story, are you guys ready to go with that? Or are you
We're still in the preclinical stage, meaning we're scaling up production of the antigens and optimizing expression systems and then testing them in the laboratory animal models. So we're doing that jointly with the Mexicans as well as a group at NIH.
Thank you.
But I think that's part of the point. The idea is not to hand over to the Iranians a bottle of vaccine. The idea is this is the exact stage where we want to work with the Iranians or the Pakistanis to say, this is how you should be working with us on research and development. I think it's much more enabling to develop these products jointly rather than making so one-dimensional, like we're doing with the Brazilians and the Mexicans.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Hotez, you gave the example, a historic example about widely distributing a drug to eliminate certain diseases. But in the context of these not infectious, but yes, is there? I mean, how much is medicine used to combat these things?
Well, the idea behind the rapid impact package, you give it once a year for several years in a row, and in a few cases, like 3 of the diseases, lymphatic filariasis, trachoma, and river blindness, they actually go away. You actually interrupt transmission, and they go away as a public health problem. It's not working so well for hookworm and schistosomiasis. You can temporarily reduce the disease burden, but it comes back. So for that's why I would argue we need vaccines as a more sustainable product. Yes?
When distributing the packages, the medicine to different countries or to the bottom billion, have you ever encountered difficulties from cultural, religious perspectives?
You mean so the question's about religious and cultural perspectives and interference on uptake. So we haven't had that problem, to my knowledge, like you've had with the oral polio vaccine in northern Nigeria or in Pakistan. So the products seem to be very welcomed by especially parents who see that children have an increased level of vigor and activity and they start growing again. So they've been, and a lot of these diseases are terribly disfiguring, especially for girls and women, so people live in deep dread of these diseases, and I think that helps to make our case as well.
Your slide related to the different regions of the United States with the health parameters, are you getting responses from various state health departments as well?
Part of the problem is the state health departments have been so depleted. They don't have the human resource capacity right now. And Texas is a good example. I mean, the people who are there, in the State Health Department in Austin, in the Harris County Health Department, and Houston Health and Human Services are top flight. They're first-rate people, but their hands are tied. They just don't have the means to embark on doing active surveillance for these diseases, which is a great tragedy. And even the problem with the diagnostic kits, they're also not widely available. They were developed 50 years ago, and they haven't benefited from modern technology to make more advanced and user-friendly diagnostic kits. So, for instance, for some of them, they still use ground-up parasites on an ELISA plate, and that's a problem as well. So it's not like you can check off, and this is for doctors as well, you can't check off the checkbox on the slip request diagnostics to say, Chagas disease test. It's just not there. And so there's a lack of availability for diagnostic testing and therefore surveillance testing as well.
Some of these medicines that you're talking about on the ranching business, they've lost their efficiency on internal parasites. Is there some kind of work with the people who are making money off these medicines in other areas to fund y'all to develop these things so they could take over, say, in the animal husbandry side?
So that's actually a very important question. So could you use support for developing, and that might be available for making veterinary products, and use it to fund products for human clinical use? That was actually an idea that I had as well, and pre-Gates era, I was going to make a veterinary hookworm vaccine because it also occurs in dogs, and then use funds to develop a human vaccine. In practice, it didn't happen. But I do remember having a very interesting interchange with an agricultural veterinary company that I won't name that told me that it's great about the idea of making an animal hookworm vaccine, but we really wanted something for fleas. If you could do something for fleas, that's $1 billion a year business. So I've always remembered that. So there's money in fleas. Yes?
Does the mobility of today's population, whether for travel or migration, affect us here? For example, we have many who come from these areas now settling here. We also just found out today that Houston will be the next gateway to Beijing, starting July 11th for their China.
Mm-hmm.
What will happen with the health of the population of these people migrating here or traveling to visit there?
Well, I think it's certainly going to make things more interesting. But I like to make the point that so far, in order to make the point, I'd like to emphasize that the people that have these tropical diseases here in Texas, there's a component of it coming from immigration, but the vast majority, I think, is coming from transmission within the state. So I like to point out the fact that by PCR, they've identified Trypanosoma cruzi, the cause of Chagas disease, in mummified remains from the Rio Grande Valley from 1,500 years ago. I actually think these diseases have been around forever, which is very characteristic of the biblical diseases. They've been around a long, long time. It's just that nobody's been looking. So I think that is a greater problem than the problem with human migrations. Human migrations is a part of it, but I think it's a smaller part of the problem.
Like we've seen, I think there was a concern a couple of years ago with TB transmission from migration that may not have been checked through an immigration process or through massive resettlements.
Yeah, the biggest problem that we're having right now with tuberculosis in the state is actually more in South Texas, and it's quite interesting. It seems to be synergistic with diabetes. So we're getting very high rates of diabetes in South Texas, and that seems to be creating increased susceptibility to tuberculosis. So we're finding a lot of things that are and this is work not done by us, but by a husband-wife team in University of Texas at Brownsville. And so that seems to be the biggest problem with tuberculosis right now in the state of Texas.
I have one more question.
Please, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we see some synergies here that we could maybe look at.
Oh,